The word, the word luthier comes from lute, but in my mind, the violin must predate the lute. Was there a, is that true? And if so, was there?
Oh God, I'm not great on the history of instruments, but I thought the lute came before the violin, but to be honest, I don't know enough about that subject. I'm not sure what came first. The lyre, maybe. I think it might have started with a lyre, actually, like a rectangular box with some strings on it. I'm not quite sure, honestly.
Well, I bet when that first violin went off, even in its early phase, I bet people were like, "Oh my God, this thing is so loud."
Mind you, with the gut strings, it wouldn't have been as loud.
As loud?
As they are these days with the steel strings and everything. I think it would have been a bit more gentle. Well, Baroque music type kind of sound, I guess. Yeah. I mean, my very first instrument in the foundation year when I started at the violin making school was a treble gamba. So it had a flat back with an angle at the top. Like a small gamba, basically. Yeah, with an arched top and sort of C-shaped F-holes. It was quite an interesting job, actually.
In guitars, we have, like, I don't know, I guess anything kind of before, the classical guitar was kind of modernized and the steel string acoustic was modernized. We have this whole kind of period of guitar that I guess kind of gets lumped together as early guitar. What kind of, in that violin family, is there a term for everything that kind of predates the more modern, what we think of as
I guess you just call it Baroque setup, which means, the neck was a different angle, it was much thicker, a different way of, the necks were basically nailed in to the body through the top block with 3 nails. So you'd start off with the rib structure and the neck being attached, and then the sort of back and front being glued to it later on. So the angle to get the elevation right would be made up by having a much thicker, sort of the fingerboard getting thicker basically towards the neck end, rather than the neck leaning back. And so, just Baroque basically, which is still, people still make Baroque violins quite regularly. I've worked on a very nice 7/8 little Amati violin that still had its original neck. Setting it up, so the bridge is different. Apart from that, I guess the bass bar is slightly different shape, but I guess it's mainly the neck angle and the way the neck is attached to the instrument, and the shape of the neck, that's mainly the difference.
So mostly, hold on a second. Everybody, as you're coming in, just give yourself a quick mute. Feel free to unmute to interject at any time. But just mute if you're not in the process of interjecting. Iris, so have you had your hand in converting or deconverting instruments from Baroque to modern and back again, or is that something?
Yes.
Is that something that
I'm personally not very keen on it, because it just means that turning something back into a Baroque instrument, it's just because everything is slightly unusual from the standard. So I've got all my measurements. The measurements are all in my head, the standard measurements and the thickness of the neck and everything. And for Baroque, everything's different. So it's easier for me to convert a Baroque instrument into a modern instrument by doing a neck graft, by putting a new neck onto the instrument, and things like that, because the bridges as well, I don't have to think about how to cut a violin bridge, but when it's a Baroque bridge, then you need to decide what kind of period is it, and they do vary slightly as well, depending on what sort of time frame you want to reproduce there. And so it's quite, to me, when someone says I need a Baroque setup, it's always a bit of a pain, just mainly because I'm never entirely sure. I need to always sort of ask colleagues who do more of that kind of work, and yeah, just not that confident about it all. It's just it's really quite different. Yeah.
How big of a, I mean, in the UK, how big of a scene is that early music? I mean, could you go out on a Friday night and go see some Baroque people getting it on, or is it
I
really?
think there is probably more than I know about, to be honest. I think there's a lot going on in London, and actually there's a shop very close to here. There's a concert hall and an early music shop that sells Baroque instruments and early music instruments in general. So I'm not so familiar with that scene, to be honest.
Yeah.
But I think there is more and more about. I know there's a lot going on in Germany with early music and Baroque music. So I think it has actually over the last 10, 20 years become a lot more popular again, and people are looking for Baroque setups using gut strings and playing that early music like it was played at that time. So yes, I think there is quite a big scene. It's not sort of my favorite go-to kind of music, really early Baroque music, but
I have a memory of being in music school in the 90s, and the music school I was going to, one of the classes, they required us to go out and see shows and write, basically a book report about the shows. And I went and I saw a Baroque ensemble. I want to say they were playing in equal temperament, and I remember thinking it was pretty challenging to listen to. Is that true, or am I misremembering that? Or maybe they were just bad at playing, but the whole thing sounded pretty cacophonous to me.
Well,
Right.
I mean, that's sort of, I don't know. I'm just not that. It's not my sort of go-to music, like I said. So it's not my favorite kind of thing. Listening to Baroque instruments and Baroque music. I'm probably going to be slated for that. So yeah, would probably agree with that in some way, but I'm not an expert. So
what is your average customer up to? Are you dealing? I mean, I guess I don't know much about it. There must be collectors, and there must be people that are primarily musicians in your world as well. What's the kind of the ratio that you're dealing with?
So I would say my main bulk of work I'd probably do for violin dealers in general, for my previous employer and for other violin dealers in the UK and abroad. But through sort of doing more stuff on social media this last year, I've had a lot more inquiries directly from musicians. I've got a very nice violin here at the moment that someone from Austria flew over last month and will be picking up in a week or two. So I do get more inquiries now directly from musicians as well. But in the sort of up to now, it's been mainly violin dealers sort of that regularly come back to me and that I've got a good working relationship with. It's based on trust, basically. I keep my hours. I might, quite often I have these instruments for months, sometimes for over a year. And I just keep my hours and I send them an invoice once a month and tell them what I've done. And so it's good to build up these kind of relationships based on trust with dealers who know my work and come back, and I kind of know I can trust them, and they pay me on time. So it's nice to know who you're working for, and they know you and I know them, kind of thing. So that's helpful. But I mean, most people I deal with, all musicians are great.
So just to clarify, so if you have an instrument for a year and you've got this ongoing thing, then you're billing per month based on your hours, and you're kind of giving them updates?
Yes.
Awesome.
Yeah, so that's basically what I do. I mean, it depends. If it's not a huge job and I know it's going to be done in a couple of months, then I might just do the one bill. But normally, if it's a bigger job, then I'll say, we'll split it in monthly payments, and most of the time that actually suits whoever I'm doing the work for as well. I quite often send them photos as I go along as well of the work I've done, and I'm very strict on myself keeping hours, keeping my time. So if a phone call comes in, I immediately stop my time, whatever I'm working on, or if I go on social media, I'll post something, you know, I'm very conscientious about literally to the next 5 minutes to make sure I only charge the person whose instrument I'm working on for the time I'm spending on it, with no, you know, if I go and make a cup of coffee, if I'm away from the bench for 10 minutes, I take that 10 minutes off that time. So I'm very strict on my timekeeping.
Do you have a mechanism for that, like a chess clock or something?
No, no, it's literally, I just literally stop I just write down the time I stop, and when I come back, I continue. Okay. I've got a bit of a system just on a small block of paper, literally, that I kind of have to do that. Well, for my own conscience, but as well, so I remember, you know, I just wouldn't remember what I've worked for and for how long. So I've got a terrible memory in general. So I just literally, as soon as I start the work, I write down who I'm working for and what the time. And then when I stop, any interruptions, I just put down the time I stopped and then start again whenever I get back to it, kind of thing.
That's really cool. You know, one of the things that I'm always curious about, you know, on the social media, I see a lot of amazing touch-up work, and, you know, but I mean, you're a full shop, so you got to cut a bridge every once in a while, correct?
Well, full shop. So I don't have a shop. I've got a workshop, which is where I'm in at the moment, which is within our private house. So I have no customers turning up at the door. Unless it's arranged, so only by arrangement. And I try and sort of keep the local musicians, you know, I've never really done any advertising in the area, and of course word spreads, and I do have quite regularly musicians turning up now, but it's not like I've got an open shop, so I don't really want to get into that daily sort of, you know, doing fingerboards and bridges and sound posts, but I don't mind it, doing it, you know. Recording really nice.
Kind of more what I was getting at was, is there any part of the work that you find frustrating? I mean, I see a lot of the posts in terms of the finish touch-up. Hold on a second, I got to meet somebody here. But do you like all aspects of it, or is your heart?
There's quite a lot of processes that I know I'm not particularly good at and I don't like doing. One of them is, after I've done peg bushings, re-drilling the holes and fitting new pegs. I've just got a real problem getting those pegs straight, and would be, you know, it quite regularly happens. I have to re-bush one of the holes again, because I'm sort of getting better because I'm taking more time over it, and I'm sort of kind of holding up the scroll and then, you know, trying to level it out. But quite often, once I've drilled I drill a very small hole first, so I can tell immediately, is it straight or is it leaning slightly? Then I use a file and try and adjust it. So that's one of the jobs I really don't like doing, and I have to do quite regularly.
Yeah.
Cutting bridges isn't particularly one of my favorite things to do either. I don't have to cut them so often, so it takes me quite a long time to cut a bridge. So I think on average for a good violin bridge, well, it'd be, as we used to say, 3 hours. You charge for 3 hours. I mean, you know, it can take me 3 to 4 to 5 hours. I'm not quick because I don't do them regularly enough. So it's actually, and also just fitting a sound post, I'm really, I just don't leave it until it's perfect. So it can take me 2 hours to cut a sound post, because I think it's absolutely crucial for the sound of the instrument that that it's not too tight, it's not too loose, it's in the perfect place, and it fits perfectly top and bottom. So I take loads of time over fitting a post, and I always have really good response about the sound. But again, you know, you can only charge so much for fitting a sound post. So it's actually probably my partly sort of setup work. And another thing that I really don't like is when you're removing a front and you end up with lots of splinters around sitting on top of the rib structure that you then carefully try and glue back what you can, but then some areas you can't use filler because it's just ripped out too much, or there's been lots of filler used in the past. So I think I put a post on Instagram recently where I showed, you know, you're doing kind of you're carving out a bit of an area and then pushing, pressing a shaving onto it. So basically you need to put some wood back, but you don't want to sort of half edge the front, which is where you're taking half of the edge away and then putting a flat piece back. So anyway, that's one of my real bugbears. I don't like to do. There's plenty of stuff I don't enjoy that much. Doing neck grafts, I love. That's why I sort of ended up doing this online course, just because it's one of my favorite things to do. And it's a big process. It involves many different sort of steps, like, the whole of doing the fingerboard and all the retouching at the end. And it's a big job, but actually doing a neck graft is one of my favorite sort of big procedures in violin restoration.
Yeah, it shows on there too how much you enjoy doing that, because boy, those are difficult to tell anything happened. So in the old days, like wouldn't somebody like you get a young person in to handle some of those things, like cutting bridges as a kind of bait to show them a thing or two about a thing or two? Or
it's quite a big commitment to actually employ someone, and so far it's just not really been something I've considered. Actually recently, when I had this Japanese friend of mine working for me, Michiko, I would quite happily employ her, but she's getting a trial with someone else now. But anyway, there's the added problem of her needing a visa and everything else. So it's actually the first time I sort of thought, maybe, but so far it's just not really been something that I've considered, because I quite like flexibility as well. I don't work that many hours a day. I sort of try and do 5 actual paid hours at the bench. So, when you've got someone in the shop and you're training them up, it does take quite a long time. When I started at Beers, Charles Beer said to me, it takes, we want you to stay for 5 years, because it takes us 2 years to train you up, 2 years to get our money back, and then we'd like a year on top of that. So I ended up staying 8 years, which was great. But I think that time, I did need that time to have the confidence to then set up on my own. And it's a big commitment that I don't mind. I quite often have someone here for work experience, maybe for a week or so, and I always consider doing that, but not actually to have someone work for me permanently.
Is that right? 60533?
Yeah.
I think I did wrong.
Hold on a second. We got somebody unmuted here. Iris, we talk a lot. You're actually part of a thing we call the Luth Long here, and we the guitar luthiers, we're constantly talking about the challenges of dealing with did I lose Iris? Iris, are you still there?
Yes.
Okay.
Yep.
The challenges of dealing with customers, and I can't help but imagine that it must scale proportionally in the violin world, in terms of we're dealing with more money and older instruments and all that. Is the potential for getting a hold of a crazy customer, is there craziness, does that scale proportionally, do you think? Or do you have to deal with anybody ever where you're just like, oh boy?
Luckily, it seems like I've been quite lucky so far, really. I've not really come across anyone where I was sort of in despair.
Yeah.
Can't think back. But if I take on an instrument that's of great value and it's a big job and I don't know the person, I do make my inquiries, let's put it that way. I do always think twice about taking it on, and it's always a bit more scary than working for someone who knows your work well, who well, they'll pay up, and it's always a bit scary, especially if it's a very expensive instrument. But then it depends also what it is. I've just had a really, really nice violin in the shop that was, just a little bit of cosmetic work, really. So it depends also what it is. Like I said, I kind of don't see that many musicians. So, because the violins and violas and cellos I take on, usually I just go into London and pick them up, bring them back for dealers that know me and I know them, and then I go back and drop them off. When I work for musicians, it's mainly sort of, yeah, it's a little bit different, but so far I've just seems like I've been lucky. And but like I said, my interaction with musicians is not that, there's not that many really.
So when you talk about you know, checking them out, are you talking to other shops and other luthiers and getting a read
Yeah,
on them?
just other dealers. Or have you heard of this guy? And then you get different opinions. In the end, I think it's quite good to go by your gut sometimes as well.
Is it a pretty small world there? Like if
It's a small world. It's a very small world. So yeah,
it's gone forever.
Yeah, no, it's a small world, so that's quite handy, really. You kind of, usually someone will have heard of that person before, especially if he or she's playing an expensive instrument or something, or if it's a dealer as well, then it is a pretty small world. So yeah, but you know, for your own sanity as well, I think it's important for me sometimes that I also turn instruments down, just, you know, when I think this is a job that would just, it's so difficult to quote for a lot of these jobs, especially if there's a lot of varnish work involved.
Yeah,
it's very difficult. If it's a standard thing like a neck graft, I can give them the amount of hours it takes on average, and you know, 30 hours for a neck graft, that's my hourly rate, and that's what you're paying, kind of thing. But if it involves a lot of pressing, for example, when the fronts have sunk and things like that, or if you have to let new pieces of wood in to fronts or backs and things like, you know, some things are very difficult to quote for. And if I look at an instrument, I think I know that even just by taking the front off, I've got such a big job on my hands because the edges are about to fall apart, etc. So I think also for my own sanity, it's quite good that I do turn work away when I think I just don't want to put myself through it, to be honest.
Yeah. I mean,
and be a nightmare.
Is that like kind of was it difficult to develop that kind of being honest with yourself about what you want to do and what you don't want to do, or what you're willing to do, and what, you know, like maybe, like for me personally, like figuring out over the years that I can say yes to this and I may feel like doing it, but you know, as soon as I get in the middle of it, I may not you know, I'm learning that process. Was that a long process?
I think that process wasn't too difficult, but I mean, it was a steep learning curve when I set up on my own to get the quoting right, you know, giving estimates. I mean, I still get it wrong, but at the beginning it was really hard, and usually you just don't quote enough for the job, because, you know, it's like when we had this price list at BS where it said, you know, 3 hours to remove a front and put a front back on. Well, if half the front ends up sticking to the ribs and you have to put pieces of wood in and glue all these splinters back, and you know, some fronts just don't come off very well, so you're already I don't know, 6 hours down from what you've quoted in the first place. So there's just usually a bit of an unknown. And I guess, you know, I quite often say to people as well, okay, this is my estimate, but you know, once the instruments apart, and you know, we might have to talk again depending on how it goes. So I guess I always leave, that's why it's called an estimate, I guess. And I also always say to people, look, it could be less, or it could be a bit more, depending on how it progresses, you know.
We have two seasoned veterans in our group that both have very different ways of estimating. We're kind of dealing with that. One will, all of the prices are probably higher than average, and then he basically, like the tough ones and the easy ones, kind of average their way out. And we have another person that does exactly like you, where it's everything is on the clock, and however it goes, however it goes, which is, you know, maybe leads to more difficult conversations with the people that have high bills, but is also more fair to the people whose projects go, you know, easily, I suppose. But
yeah, I also tend to, for local, if it's a smaller job, I tend to end up just charging them less. I just look at it and think, you know, what I can charge to dealers. Sometimes I feel, you know, I just,
Yeah.
I'm usually a bit more lenient and probably let them off an hour or two. You know, if something's taken a bit longer than I think it should. So I'm you know, in that way, I'm probably more generous towards you know, especially local musicians where it's not such a big job, to be honest.
So I wanted to ask you about, we had one of our guys, Alex Jones, he recently had a really valuable guitar that he had a break in the headstock on, and he reached out to you and you walked him through some of your chalking techniques. And I've done chalking over the course of my life, or over the course of my career. And Alex produced something that was far superior to anything I've ever produced. So I wanted to ask you, what did you tell him? Like
I have to try and remember now which one that was. But I guess when it comes to chalk fitting, so you have really two different scenarios. One is that it's quite a large area where you fit a sort of solid piece of wood to another piece of wood, to the original. In that case, you know, you try and remove as little of the original wood as possible, but you kind of want a pretty smooth area. The other thing you want is that the edges around which area you're doing are nice and crisp. So you want a clean edge around, like on a violin, it would be a soundpost patch, for example. You don't want a softened edge. You want a really clean, sharp edge around that area where you're fitting a piece of wood to. Then the other thing is obviously matching the wood as close as possible to the original. So that's how you kind of get your wood choice. And I guess with guitar wood, I assume it's often the kind of, not so much the grain lines, is it? It's more is that medullary rays you call them on mahogany and stuff? You know, like the long sort of.
Yeah, I guess the
flex and lines and
the flex would be probably the rays, and yeah, the grain lines are open on some of those woods. So yeah.
Yeah, so anyway, you try and match that as well as you can. Then the next thing really is that you always want to put the piece of wood you're fitting to the original back in exactly the same place and at the same angle. So ideally you're kind of clamping something around it, or if in my case, which is usually on the inside of instruments, I can glue little studs, like on a soundpost patch, you know, you glue 4 little studs, so that you're kind of fitting that piece of wood from the top down into the same position every single time. So to start off with, I would just do a rough fit, and then I would clamp it on, fit those studs, and then literally after that, it always goes exactly in the same position every single time. And that's when I probably start to use chalk. So I use this Pelican chalk from Germany. I mean, I don't know if they really vary that much, but I basically put the chalk on the original wood, and then I just feed that piece of wood that I'm fitting to it every time onto the wood, kind of push it quite hard, take it back out. And what I use is a chisel. Most of the time it's kind of a convex curve. That means you can use a chisel, and I just chisel away at all the areas that show up the chalk, and keep doing that pretty much until I can see the chalk everywhere. On a violin, you might get the added problem that it's actually so thin, the original wood, that there's a little bit of sponginess right in the middle. So then what we have to do then is what's called a double fit, which means you keep making sure the chalk is everywhere. Then you keep taking the chalk away from the outside to make sure you've really got it pushed right down into the cast. But in any other case, if you've got a solid guitar neck or whatever you're doing, you just keep removing the chalk literally until there's chalk showing up everywhere. And then at the very end, when I'm pretty much sure it's almost there, then I actually use a scraper and just continue to do the same thing. And then you might end up, what I do sort of towards the end, I actually glue size the piece of wood that I'm fitting. Because if you've got end grain, when you're kind of gluing it, that might swell up a bit more than the rest of it. So I give it a wash with thin hide glue, And then I go back and do that maybe a couple of times to re-chalk fit that same piece. And then in the end, I glue it in with quite a lot of, with quite a bit of pressure. You know, usually that have a front or a back in a cast, basically. Is
that's I wanted to get into the weeds a little bit on how you apply the chalk to the piece that you're going to fit to. Are you just basically drawing the chalk in there like you would like
yeah,
on a
there's no method to it. It's literally, I usually just break one of my bigger sticks in half and just literally go across and make sure it's everywhere. And I do it probably every second or third time of feeding the piece of wood to it. I re-chalk it.
So
just to really see.
Just a hand application. And do you find that it like one of the things that I noticed is it kind of caked up in some spots or I don't know. Like
oh, right. Yes. I mean, sometimes I might just take a brush and sort of brush it out and then apply it fresh, but it doesn't seem to cause any problems in particular, even if it gets a bit thick in some areas. It's usually okay. I just kind of, in the end, before I do the final, when I actually glue it, then I just brush out the chalk. I'm not worried about really cleaning it out with anything else. I literally, if it might actually be a little bit dusty still in there, but I've never worried about that.
Do you find that there's like, is there a good like lighting scenario or something to really see the chalk? Do you ever struggle to see the chalk? Or
sometimes with light and shade it works quite well. It's something that I quite like doing, so evening, especially in the winter when it gets a bit darker. It's tricky to see sometimes during the day, but it's just by holding it at different angles really that I manage. And then when you actually glue size the piece towards the end, that really shows it up very clearly as well.
Yeah.
And then you think, oh my God, I'm miles away again. But then actually quite quickly you get back to where you were. And I think it's worth doing the glue sizing once or twice towards the end.
So you're going to size it more than once because you're going to blast through your sizing, reshape into the sizing?
I do the sizing a couple of times with quite thin hide glue towards the end, and then I'm usually pretty confident it should be good enough, really.
If you were gluing in like on an exterior where you were trying to minimize I guess you're always trying to minimize the glue line, but are you using a different adhesive than hide glue for like things where you're going to touch up? Or
no, I always use hide glue. I mean, I've been using a Japanese glue that seems a little bit lighter in color, that's working quite well, but I've never really noticed much of a difference with a different type of glues, to be honest. If it's a good fit, it shouldn't really show up the grain line the joint line too much.
Yeah.
But then, you know, in my kind of work, fitting pieces of wood, it's usually on the inside of the instrument. So I guess that's where it's quite different to your guitars, to necks and things, because that's always on the outside. So
it's always on the outside.
Chalk fitting patches is usually on the inside of an instrument, if it's a violin, viola, or a cello. The other, that's kind of when you use, so that I said earlier on, there's two different scenarios. What I meant was the one where you have a solid piece of wood that you're fitting, and the other scenario is when you've actually got a flexible shaving or something where it's not much of chalk fitting, but I do usually do a little, like if I'm doing something from the outside just along between two grain lines or something, so it's quite a flexible shaving that might only be 2 or 3 millimeters thick. So the fit doesn't have to be perfect, but it's usually where the shaving sort of starts and finishes, how it comes up when you've gouged out a shaving, that it still kind of fits that shape. So that's where I usually also use a little bit. There's a post on my Instagram account where I did that on a violin scroll. And so I still do chalk fit sometimes when I just even use a flexible shaving, but it's quite quick and it's not so accurate because you obviously can't sort of always position it exactly. In that case, I often just draw myself a couple or 3 sort of pencil lines from the shaving across to the original somehow, or with China graph or something, just to make sure I always end up putting it in the same position. because you can't really have any studs, it's too small. So, and then I usually have that slightly, once it's pressed down, then it's slightly proud, and then I sort of shape, then I cut it down with a gouge or a chisel.
Say that one more time. How so when you don't have the studs and say you're doing like a shaving, how are you indexing that?
So just if it's on the inside of the instrument, I usually just literally put some pencil lines across from the shaving onto the original. So even when I glue it in, I can see that it lines up in all directions. Okay. So like, you know, just 2 or 3 pencil lines across. So every time I put the shaving back, it goes back in exactly the same position as before. And also when I glue it, I make sure it doesn't shift around. So yeah, no, it does. Chalk fitting it works pretty well, I think.
Do you leave the studs in on a soundpost patch when you glue the soundpost patch in?
Yeah, everything's, yeah, that's the thing, because it's like with gluing a bass bar in as well, I always have 3 studs on the inside of the instrument when I'm gluing it in, just to make sure, because it can, depending on what type of glue you have, it can really start shifting around. Yeah. So I think it's important to keep the studs until it's glued, and then I just remove the studs as I'm cutting down the soundpost patch.
Do you size the plate side too before you glue in, or is that
yes? You mean before you glue the plates onto the rib structure?
No, like on a soundpost patch, you were sizing the patch that was going to go in, but do you also size the plate side of the?
I don't actually, because it's kind of difficult to then go back and clean it up again. So I don't actually usually do the original wood. I usually just glue size the actual patch, and hopefully that sort of does it really.
Cool. Well, it sounds like all I need to do is try harder next time.
If I'd had more time, I ran out of time today, but I did actually take a little video recently of me removing the chalk with a chisel on a piece of wood. I'll try and see if I can find it.
Okay. I can put that as an addendum on here. That would be nice.
Yeah.
I wanted to go through your Instagram, but I also want to ask anybody if open it up for anybody in the Zoom if they have any questions so far on what they've heard. If you do, actually we've got quite a few people here.
The other thing I was going to say, I can't, because I'm talking to you all the time, I can't look at any questions in the chat. So if someone else can read out the questions to me, because I can't do.
Yeah, I don't think we have.
I don't know if there was anything for me so far or not.
I don't think we have anything on the chat.
Yeah, I got one.
Yeah, Andy.
Yeah, I was. It's going back to what you were saying about the converting between Baroque and like the gut strings and the steel strings. Do you have to do much work to the top plates to sort of strengthen up the top plates to take the extra strength of the steel strings and the tension?
Not really, actually. Funny enough, the thickness of the front doesn't seem to be any different necessarily, just because I'm, if I'm changing something from a Baroque instrument. I mean, if it's a thin instrument, then I would probably strengthen it with some straps, but that wouldn't be influenced by whether it's got the steel strings or gut strings, to be honest.
Okay.
You know, most instruments that I work on were originally as a Baroque setup. That doesn't seem to be, I mean, the main difference, I guess, is the shape of the bass bar when you're looking at the front. Apart from that, really, I can't think of any difference in thicknesses particularly.
Okay, thank you. Cheers.
All right, I'm going to screen share, I think.
Hey, Iris, I just had a quick question there. So you work for Charles. Did you go to Newark or Mittenwald?
I did, yeah.
You went to Newark, okay.
Yes, yes. For 4 years, from 92 to 96. And then I was at Beers for 8 years after
92 to 96. Was Guy Harrison there with you?
Yes, he was actually.
Oh, he was,
yes,
okay.
yeah. He's a great maker, really great maker. Yeah, he was, I think, a couple of years ahead of me. Yeah, very good maker, brilliant work. Yeah.
Was Hargrave instructing there at that time?
No, I don't think, was he ever teaching there? I mean, he was there himself, but I don't think he
Yeah.
ever taught in
Or was
Newark,
it
as far as I know.
was Saunders teaching there maybe?
Will
Jacob's dad?
Saunders.
Yeah, Wilf, yeah.
Yes, he
Okay.
wasn't teaching there at the time, but I remember Pat Jowett, who was my favorite teacher there in Newark. He was good friends with Wilf, and I think I met Wilf once while I was in Newark.
Do you know Jacob?
I don't think I've met him. I know
Okay.
I know of. Is in Austria, isn't he? Or
He's in Austria now, yeah.
Yeah, no, I don't think I've actually ever met him, but I know
Yeah.
of him. Mhm.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Iris, can we look at some of your Instagram posts and maybe
Sure.
chit chat with you about them? Okay, hold on. All right, Iris, can you see the?
Yes.
are
Yeah, I
we-
can see that. Yeah, yeah.
Okay, so this, like, if this presented itself on a guitar that was valuable, this would give me anxiety.
Not me,
So-
because all the original splinters are there. What are you worried about?
Well, I mean, so
It's when
there's a
there's
lot.
one missing when you have
Yeah.
to start worrying.
There's just a lot. There's just a lot happening cross grain there. You know, there's like all of these little cross grain things, and I mean, I don't see anything cross grain there in the after picture. So, I kind of
So
want.
yeah, no, I was pleased how that went. Actually, it was actually a brand new instrument that hadn't even been sold yet.
Yeah.
A local maker who suddenly realized in his showroom, well, something happened. He doesn't know when or where or how. So it's an insurance job. He only lives about an hour away from here, so he dropped it round. So because it's on a rib, and the rib is only, I don't know, 1.2 millimeters thick, and so basically the front had to come off. So luckily the front came off really easily and really well. No splinters. My dream of removing a front on this was great. So the next thing is literally just, you've got everything there, all the bits are there. I don't think it needed much cleaning. So it was literally a matter of trying to get glue into all those little cracks and areas. So by flexing them a little bit from behind and just getting the glue in all those nooks and crannies and onto the area, and then using two hard plastics. I think there is a photo also of the gluing. Yeah, so I just put some soap basically on the inside of the plastic, you know, so that, because what you don't want is you want the plastic to stick to the varnish, and then you remove the plastic and pull half the varnish off with it. Same on the inside, really hard plastic with as many clamps I can get onto the area, and literally just pressing it flat.
Iris, can I interject really quick?
Mm-hmm.
Soap. You're using soap to keep from
just to keep the plastic from sticking against the varnish, because I mean I remove a little bit of the glue before I press it together, but there's always a bit of glue will squeeze out, so I make sure I put some soap onto the plastic, which is just sitting on the outside of, so it doesn't go into the cracks, you know, it's just that glue will squeeze out, and just to make sure that I don't end up damaging the varnish, because when you then pull the plastic away afterwards, the plastic could literally get glued to the varnish, and then you're ending up removing original varnish there, so that's quite important.
Any particular soap? You know, like I've always used like wax paper, and then there's times where wax paper just will not work, and I've been tempted to use wax, but I don't want to get wax, you know, paste wax into my project.
I've literally got a piece of just bar soap, really old piece that I use for everything. I use it for pegs, I use it for that sort of thing. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Awesome.
So
okay.
Yeah, that's important. Literally just needed pressing flat, really, and because it's so flexible, it's only like 1.2, around 1.2 millimeters thick, that piece of rib, so it's you know, quite easily you can manipulate it, and all you want is that flat surface back again on the outside.
Are these lines here indicating anything, or is this?
No, that was just for me to know which side I'd put the soap on, I think.
Okay.
Doesn't really actually mean anything other than which side, you know, put it the right way. I just put a little circle to know that one, it's this way round, basically. Yeah.
And then is this our our old friend Deft?
Yes, I mean, I did have to, you can probably see in that where the crack is going along the sort of, as the flames are running. Yeah, along there. I did actually use a little bit of filler in there. And I think we spoke about that before. I used Scotch-Lite. I use Scotch-Lite filler, which is basically a white glass powder that I then color with different kind of inks to get to wood color. Slightly darker because it dries a little bit lighter, and so I did have to put a little bit of filler in some of those areas, so it wasn't actually completely perfectly flat. I mean, there was a little bit of obviously some tiny, almost invisible bits of wood at probably. But anyway, I think we spoke about that in the first Zoom we did together. Yeah, so that would be on your site somewhere as well. Anyway, so how I do that, because I mix it with hide glue. I basically make a wood paste, and the reason I use that is because on these kind of instruments, the reflection is always an issue. When you're turning the instrument and you're doing the retouching, it might look right in one direction, but then not in another. And with this kind of filler, it sort of helps a little bit because somehow it seems to bounce the light off in a way that's better than other kind of standard water-based wood fillers.
Yeah.
So yes, and then Deft goes on top. Once that Scotch-Lite filler is dry, Deft goes on top. I have to wait a day or two for that to dry, and then I literally just scrape that flat. Because it's always, I mean, texture in general, which means what it looks like when the light bounces off the surface is very underrated in terms of getting a good job done. To me, that's very important, but it's also very time consuming and quite boring to do all that scraping off Deft. And
so originally the varnish color would have been closer to the wood, correct? Like you're actually creating kind of a barrier layer of Deft and then touching up on top of the Deft.
Yeah, I find that it's easier for me to create the texture beforehand because my retouch varnish is so thin, and then there'll be a coat of clear goes over the top of that area and a slightly wider at the end. So because my retouch varnish that I apply is mainly alcohol with a tiny amount of spirit varnish in it. That's why it actually can go on top of the Deft almost after the texture is already finished.
Yeah, and by texture you mean all of this kind of this stuff where it's actually shrunk back into the wood grain, or
by texture I kind of mean what it looks like when you can see the light bouncing off the surface there. That maker actually leaves the surface quite almost unfinished in a way, just as it comes off the brush. There's quite a lot of bits in there, and it's a little bit, quite shiny and left quite rough in a way. He doesn't cut it back at all. So you kind of, whatever texture you're given by the original, you kind of have to imitate what's around it so that you don't see any difference when the light bounces off that surface. It should look the same as the original around it. So here you can see it looks too flat. So it looks flat, it's all blending in, but when you're looking at the original and then the Deft area, it's got more flatness to it. It looks rougher. So then afterwards, with putting the retouch on top and the clear varnish, hopefully that sort of matches in better with the original than actually on this picture. But that's basically what I aim for, is to sort of blend it in so that you really basically end up with the same.
So this is, even though this is, looking good, this is still cross-grained. Does this give you concern? Are you doing anything to kind of work around this to disguise it?
So this is where I put the filler on. So you can see the Scotch-Lite filler is sitting in that sort of cross area. So that would have sort of filled it. It would have not been very deep. It would have only been sort of just to level the surface. But then that also means I might have to adjust my retouching on top. If it's a bit darker than the surrounding area, then I wouldn't touch that area until I've sort of got the same kind of color all around. So it all comes, that kind of needs to be considered when I do my retouching as well.
Some of what I see is you adding adding figure with color, would you ever be tempted to bring a one of these flames up and have it meet that, or is that?
Yeah, I do. I mean, I wouldn't probably do that until I've kind of just blended in the sort of first basic ground color, the sort of color in between the flames first. Well, actually, no. I mean, as I go along, I just copy what goes across, but you also obviously have to be careful when you're turning the instrument. The flames might actually be next to the flames you can see now.
Yeah.
So you always, with those kind of, with a maple, it's always taking all that into consideration. And when I'm retouching, I literally turn the instrument all of the time to make sure it won't look too dark from a certain direction. It needs to work in all directions, really. But then again, when you're doing peg bushings, for example, and you've got end grain, you can't really win. So in those scenarios, I just make it look direction that most people would look at most of the time. So
yeah. So here we see kind of a montage of it disappearing, it looks like. Yeah,
so I just kind of usually start from the edges, really working my way towards the more tricky area in the middle where I did have that kind of wood filler in there as well. And just, yeah, I mean, sometimes, I mean, this was a fairly straightforward one, really. It's more tricky when you've got an area where you've got different kind of staining of the wood underneath, for example, when you've got grayer and brighter areas. So you kind of have to even that out first. So my aim is, when I start any job, any retouching job, is to even out the first color, really, the color that sits lowest on the wood, like the lightest yellow, bring that across to all the other areas. And then if there's some areas that are a bit stained or so I need to then change my retouching color to a brighter color to even out that darker ground. That, if it's a grayer ground, you need to basically then put a brighter color on top to match it with the rest. So it's always a bit of a game, to try and even out the ground color, and then it's easier to put, to put the rest on top, because once you've got an even color off the ground, and then you can just kind of use the same color for the rest of it in a way.
So here there's a flame that's going kind of in here. Are you just bringing out a flame that was originally there? I mean, I guess what was the original way that he would have got these flames to stand out? Was this just like spirit varnish over bare wood, or did he do any bare wood dyeing first?
It looks to me like he did put quite a lot of color into the ground. So, there's definitely a bit of stain going on. So in a way that made it easier for me, because when you're putting some stain into the wood, in a way, it sort of almost dulls down the movement slightly.
Yeah.
Or it also means that from every angle you can see that flame slightly, whereas if you have the barrier between the wood and the varnish, then in some directions you literally don't see the flame, and in the other direction you see it really strongly. Whereas if there's some staining in the wood, you can see a little bit of the flames in all directions. So that helped me. So what I did here, I actually enhanced that flame.
Yeah. That
you probably wouldn't have seen particularly before from one certain direction, but because of the staining in the wood, it made it easier for me to hide that up.
So there was actually maybe a little bit of flame here originally.
I think there was a flame here, which would have been more obvious from another direction, and not so much from this angle. So
and you handed this back and he went, "Oh my God," right?
Yeah, he was very, very happy, especially because I did it quite quickly as well, but that was partly to do with the fact that front came off so easily. So that was quite a fun job to do. It did it.
Iris, is there anything in here? I mean, this peghead graft, I mean, is stunning. Is there anything in here you want to talk about that you think? This is kind of the one that was having to do with one of the questions I had earlier, which was the selection of of wood, but I don't know.
Yeah, so on a front, I would basically split a piece of wood, assuming that hopefully the piece of wood that was used for the front originally would have come from a split piece. Then you try and match the width of the grain, the different angles, and that's often all that you can do really. And then keep your fingers crossed, because you won't know until you start the retouching whether how it's actually going to work out, which is always can be very frustrating.
How much of the raise are you looking at here to kind of determine where it's at? Is it all in the reflectance, or are you looking at kind of?
I do look at it a little bit just to compare to the original. Hopefully, I mean it's a very difficult piece of wood because it's a cello front, but the grain is extremely narrow. Because I always like sort of enhancing grain lines on fronts, but with this cello front, they're almost invisible. So in this case, it would have been more important to also look at the medullary rays and see which direction they go. And if you get the piece of wood at the right angle, it should quite easily match basically the medullary rays. And it depends what you're matching, whether I'm looking more at the medullary rays or the I mean, I always try and match the grain really, but sometimes they're more important than other times.
On the enhancement of grain lines, is there a limit to how small you can paint? Like, I mean, if you have a grain line, I mean, I find that I run into like just like viscosity issues on my brush, and like I can't sometimes paint down to like the sizes that I'm interested in. We're dealing with different mediums, but I know varnish can be tricky to get to come off the brush too. Do you?
Yeah, I mean, my brushes work very well because they keep a lot of the varnish in, but it's still a very pointy brush. So you need quite a lot of intense pigment, but you also need just enough, not too much varnish, just enough varnish that it actually comes off the brush. So I use my brush always very dry when I paint grain lines, but I mean, they can be pretty narrow. I guess if it gets less than 0.3 of a mil or something, then it starts to get a bit tricky, but it does help a lot. And I use this method a lot on fronts, and also like on this neck graft, we just looked at my recent post, I did paint the grain lines through a little bit on that.
These are,
yeah, so they are sort of painted through from the original onto the graft, just to sort of fool the eye a little bit. And also the flex, I sort of at least enhanced a bit. They actually did match quite well on the new neck anyway, and yeah, but you can see I've sort of painted some flecks in there just to bring them across.
So you put on dry with just enough varnish to, you know, kind of, you know, bind the pigments in place. Are you having to do come back over it with actual spirit varnish? And if so, is it hard to keep from kind of fuzzing out these intricate grain lines that you're painting?
Sorry, I'm not quite sure what. So I do the grain lines and I make sure the ground is okay. I always end up putting, with a slightly wider brush, I'll put some clear retouch alcohol varnish over the top again, over the whole area. What I also do a lot is I pad the area with my hand all the time, like often with the end of my hand here, just kind of pad it to not end up with brush marks. And that sort of thing, it works especially well on peg, on the side of peg bush, on peg walls.
One of the things we deal with in guitars is we have, you know, pigments and dyes, you know, oftentimes on the same instrument, and the lacquer has very aggressive solvents in it, like more aggressive than alcohol. And so like a lot of times, if you're not careful, you can spray a clear coat onto something and then have your touch up kind of move around on you, but that's not an issue with brushing clear varnish over your touch up.
It can be if you do it, it's like you just do it the once and you leave it. And quite often, I mean, like I said, quite often I end up just padding the varnish straight after I've put it on. And I mean, it quite often happens that I accidentally then take all my retouch or part of my retouch varnish off again that I've just done. So it's a bit of a, yeah, it can happen quite easily as
Okay.
well. And also, you know, you go, the best is to just do it, put it on once and leave it, give it enough time. Then you could maybe still manipulate the texture slightly with your hand or whatever, but then just give it a bit of time. Yeah, sometimes when I'm impatient, it can happen that I end up putting stuff off again, which is really annoying, but it definitely happens. Yeah.
This is stunning. I mean, this is really, really, I mean,
Thank
I don't
you.
even know
Yeah,
what to
no,
say
it's
about
quite
that.
fun doing this one because actually the neck graft is a good neck graft. It's just it was a bit too bright orange mainly around there, so it did took a little bit of time to remove what was on there, but yeah, it did look much better in the end. It's actually a very pale varnish all round, so it matches much better now.
How often, I mean, we deal with this in guitars a lot where, you know, like the competency doesn't overlap. Like, so whoever did this repair initially, their woodworking skills were pretty top shelf. Is that correct?
Yeah, definitely.
Like, how often do you find it that somebody can do kind of the mechanical side and just they don't have the eye for doing the
yeah, it's so incredibly common. The problem is there isn't really anywhere to learn this kind of skill unless you kind of manage to be one of the few to get into a really good shop where they take the time off to teach you. And, you know, it's just basically that there is definitely a lack of teaching out there for learning those kind of skills. It is difficult to find somewhere good. And yeah.
Where are you at with innovation on these skills? Are you bringing new stuff to the craft, or are you pretty much replicating the way that you were taught?
Yeah, no, I'm pretty much replicating. I mean, most of I wouldn't say I can't even think of one thing in particular that I've come up with. I mean, I'm kind of picking stuff up from other people. It's like the Scotch light. I'm pretty sure I learned from Eliane LeBlanc at Oberlin or someone. You know, it's always usually I pick things up from other people when I make changes in my own work. It's I'm not too good at sort of doing experimentation myself, to be honest, but it's just kind of, I guess I've developed certain techniques maybe on my own. I've just kind of got better at it over the years. I guess it's just experience and just really enjoying trying to make bits of wood disappear really, or blending in, you know. It's just that's my favorite thing.
You know, a lot of times innovation, like it's hard to know where it is because you're taking like all of these different things that you know, but like, you know, I come up with it all the time when I try to explain somebody, you know, how I do something, and it's really like I haven't thought about it, you know, like I haven't thought about it long enough to go, oh yeah, you hold the airbrush this way instead of that way because, you know, it does X, Y, and Z. Like, so anyway, so how psyched were you to see your husband getting into the game?
Well, I mean, we met at violin making school, and he sort of dabbled, you know, he's into lots of different things. He loves restoring classic cars. He's building a boat at the moment. I mean, he's always got a project on the go. He's restoring an old motorbike. I mean, and then every so often he has another go at one of his instruments. But anyway, this is an instrument he made in Newark. I think a really nice copy of a Peter of Venice, you know, who sort of used to leave quite a lot of these gouge marks around the head. And anyway, it's always been hanging in my workshop literally since I mean, he left in 97, never varnished it. So we're recently thinking we really should, you know, 2 or 3 of his instruments were sitting here. So, but just kind of bit by bit. I mean, he's varnished them. I bought the varnish from Eugene Holtier, which is quite a well-known guy in the violin world making varnish. There's Joe Robson as well. And so it's kind of ready-made varnish, which takes the scariness out a little bit because, you know, you're ending up with something decent. So he's actually sold a couple of violas recently, but this one the scary thing about this one is that it's got a neck raft already. It's got an ebony crown. So it's kind of, he wanted always to antique it. And even though I kind of deal with blending things into an old instrument, it's so different to start off with a blank slate and to try and antique an instrument from scratch. It's just, I have so much respect for people, doing it in a good way, because it's just very hard to make it look convincing. And it's going to be a one-off for us. I'm kind of trying to help him, but I'm really daunted by it. And the head looks okay. Now I think it looks quite good, but we haven't really started that much on the rest of the instrument yet. So it's a scary thing.
Well, it looks great. I mean, I know
it's a really nice instrument. It's just the antiquing process seems to take really literally as long as it takes to make the whole instrument and varnish it. I don't know. It's just crazy, this whole thing. But
we have people doing it in the guitar world, and oh boy, 95% of it to me looks pretty tragic. But those guys that get it, it makes you wonder, it's I think the guys that do it well, it seems like they're telling a story, like.
Yeah, no,
really
I mean, some people, it's like, we mentioned Guy Harrison earlier. I think he does a bit of antiquing. And Andrew Ryan, people like that, Andrew Finnegan in Germany. I mean, there's a lot of very good people out there, Ryan Soltis, and there's a lot of people who do amazing antiquing. Well,
Iris, by the way, this really made me chuckle.
Did it?
My grandparents had this book when I was coming up, and I've thought about that picture. I don't know how many times I've thought about that. And it totally looks
really?
like that. Yeah.
I love that book. I mean, I read it a few times when I was younger, and I just immediately, when I saw that bass bar, it sort of brought back all the memories.
This is an effective use of the internet, by the way. This is what the internet's meant for, is this kind of juxtapositioning, borderline memeage here. Well,
yeah,
Iris, I've had you for an hour. You've been very gracious. Should I let you get going, or do you want to take a couple, see if anybody's got any more questions? Or
yeah, I'm happy to answer some more questions.
Does anybody have any questions for Iris on what they've heard? Sharon, you look like you want to ask a question. Maybe not.
I've got one.
Okay.
I'd love to hear a little bit more about this Scotch-Lite process. Thank you.
Sure. I'm wondering if I can also
you should be able to
arrange something. I mean, I also talk about this on my, because I have got some online teaching available, and that's part of my, which one is it? There's 2 Zoom lectures I've done, and it's the one to do with crack repair. So basically it's, I can show you, 1 second.
Everybody, just to plug Iris's Zoom, I got her, I didn't realize you had 2. I've got your first one, and it's awesome, of course.
Thank you. So it's a white powder that's very volatile, actually. It's probably best to wear a mask when you're actually using this. So I pour a little bit of this powder onto a piece of wood that I've actually warmed up first, or it could be a tile. It's basically, I'm going to make a paste using hide glue with this powder. So the first thing I do, I pour this onto a slightly warm plate. I use a knife like this to I drop a few blobs of glue onto the powder and make a paste from it. So you basically have a paste like a normal kind of water-based wood filler or something. And then I've got some inks. They're Winsor and Newton ink colors. So I've got a yellow, a red, sepia, I think sort of a browny color, and a black color. And then I just use a little stick and dip it into each pot. And I kind of try and I work these colors into the paste until I end up with something that looks like the wood color that I need, and possibly slightly darker than wood color, because it dries a little bit lighter. So basically I've got a paste that's got the same sort of color as the ground. And then I use the knife again to just put that paste into an area where, it's just a little bit of a gap or something, or like in where we were seeing on the ribs. So I put it in, and then I just literally, with a piece of kitchen roll or something, I just wipe it. So I don't have to remove any more after it's dry, basically. Because it's glass, it's almost like glass bubbles, this powder. So you don't want to have to work it away afterwards. So just with a slightly damp piece of kitchen roll or something, I just wipe the surface so it sits in the areas I want it to sit in. So for violins, it's basically with a reflection issue, it seems to work quite well, but you can't put any color on top of that. Once it's dry and you think actually it looks a little bit too light, you can't put any color straight on it, because then you kill kind of the effect that it gives you to help with the reflection. So basically, once it's on there, just leave it to dry, and then the deft goes on there, some kind of filler varnish. You basically need a barrier straight on top of it, some clear varnish or something. And then the retouch goes on top of that, and with sort of maple and spruce and that kind. Anyway, it just seems to work quite well to sort of avoid this problem that you have with other wood fillers, where you look from one direction, it looks right in one direction, and then you turn the instrument, it just sticks out like a sore thumb from the other direction.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
So just as a side note, I found some glass micro, I think they're called glass microbeads from 3M. And they actually have quite a few different sizes. I mean, they all look like a powder to me.
Yeah.
I thought about trying different sizes to see if it gave different kind of angle of observation, different angle of observation.
I seem to remember something about 22, whatever that's micro something. Yeah. So the one that I use is from Kramer, and I think it says something about 22.
Yeah.
Whatever.
Yeah. I got to get over and visit. Is it Kramer Pigments? I forget. Is
Kramer. Yeah, I
Kramer?
ordered them. I mean.
Yeah, they're in the city, and I've had it on my list of things to go visit. I imagine its interior that must be nuts. Before I let Iris go, everybody unmute and say thank you very much.
Thanks, Iris.
Because Iris.
Thanks, Iris.
Thank you.
Thanks, Iris.
Thank you,
Always fun to hear you.
Thank you,
Iris.
As usual, I have.
Thanks, Iris.
I have probably 5 or 6 actionable items I'm gonna be trying out in my shop as a result of your very, very generous time with us. So, Iris,
it's been my pleasure.
from
Very
the bottom
nice
of my
to
heart,
see you
thank
all
you very
and have a
much.
chat. You're welcome.
Everybody, enjoy the rest of the list long. I'm gonna bug out, so I'll see you guys all on Wednesday.
Thank
Cool.
you.
All right.
All right.
Have a good what's left of the weekend.
Hey.
Take care.
Hey,
Sure.
Iris, Stratter del Jesu.
I think
question.
Strad, actually. I think Strad.
Really?
Ooh.
Yeah.
See y'all.
Actually, difficult
Bye.
one. All right. Bye.
Bye.